This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for joining us today on Beyond the Big Screen, and we're here to discuss today the 1958 fictionalized documentary called Hello, London, alternatively known as London Calling. We will discuss the evolution of figure skating over the course of the 20th century, the famous figure skater Sonja Henie, and the complex sport and industry of figure skating. I'm very happy today to be joined by Ryan Stevens to discuss this interesting production. Thanks for joining us, Ryan.
It's my absolute pleasure to be on the show.
Ryan Stevens is a former competitive figure skater and CFSA Skate Canada judge. He has been writing about figure skating since 2013. Ryan has had media credentials with Skate Canada, covering the 2016 Canadian Tire National Skating Championship in Halifax, as well as conducting interviews with many top figure skaters, past and present. In June 2017, Ryan released a full-length biography of British actress, figure skater, and dancer Belita Jepson-Turner, a contemporary and perceived rival of Sonja Henie, who we're going to talk a lot about today. Ryan's blog, SkateGuard, can be found at skateguard1.blogspot.ca and in the show notes. I'll briefly just discuss the production details. It was a limited release in 1958. The film was never officially widely released in the United States. It has a runtime of 78 minutes, and as I said, it was released in the UK in 1960 as London Calling. Sonja Henie, which we'll talk about more as well, was a very popular actress in about the middle part of the previous century, and this was her last film. Ryan, maybe you can give us a little bit of background on this film and how it ties into early and mid 20th century figure skating.
Well, Hello, London was it was an attempt at a comeback for Sonja Henie. She'd been, after turning professional and coming to America in 1936 after winning her third Olympic gold medal, she was signed with 20th Century Fox, and she produced these very lavish, skating-driven films that were huge box office hits. But after the war, and as is the case with many actresses, if you look at an actress like Esther Williams, she was a swimmer. So these kind of vehicles that are driven by a specialty, such as swimming or skating, obviously the skaters that were in the skating movies, they were able to sustain that fame for a certain level of time, and it dwindled off. And that kind of happened with Sonja a little bit. And at the time, she was doing shows at the Center Theater in New York and touring with her own ice review. So when Hello, London came out, it was an attempt at a comeback of sorts for her in the film world. She was going to do, or planning to do, a series of films where she visited different cities. So this one was based around her tour going to London, and then she was, looking at doing Hello, Paris, Hello, St. Moritz, Hello, Oslo, just different European cities and capitals around the world, and kind of tying in the stars, musical and theatrical stars from the countries that she visited. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. This ended up being her last film, but it certainly is a really wonderful example of how skating, carnival, like hotel shows and carnival style productions and touring productions were thriving during that era. And it spoke more to the roadshow aspect of skating, of professional skating, than of the plot-driven stories that were in her other films.
Yeah, but I thought it was a really cool idea, especially when before when we were planning this, that this was a promotional piece that probably worked really well for her skating enterprise, as well as a tourism type show, almost like a proto Travel Channel show.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, definitely. Well, at the time in England, these ice pantomimes were thriving, which was quite interesting because in America, it was all about these hotel shows and touring productions. But the ice pantomimes in England, during the era when this film were released, they were almost like stage shows on ice where the skaters would lip sync along to pre-recorded voice tracks. So it was really quite interesting because at the time, skating was thriving in a different way in England, professional skating was, than it was in America. And I think that this was, in a way, Sonia's way of trying to get in on that market.
You use that term hotel show. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what a hotel show was.
Well, imagine going into a supper club or a restaurant at a hotel, being seated at a table to have your supper, to have a few cocktails, and watching a figure skating show on a small tank of ice while you were having dinner or having a few drinks. These shows would have usually a live singer or two. They'd have a small cast of skaters and usually some novelty acts. They might have a juggler. They might have a physical comedian, something along those lines. But they were small variety shows centered around skating that you could watch while you were having supper. And they were huge in hotels across America in they actually started back before Prohibition, died out for some time, and then they made a comeback. And during the era that this film would have come out, they still would have been thriving in many U.S. cities.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah.
What would it be? Is there an analogy to that today, or did they carry through at all to closer to our times?
Well, I mean, if you look at today, skating has certainly changed on the professional side. There isn't a lot of it, unfortunately. But there are still skating shows on cruise ships that people can watch. There are skating shows that hit different theme parks, like, for instance, Canada's Wonderland. I know they've had a nice show before as well. So those kinds of things still go on, but not in the same scale as they did.
Ice skating is a really interesting sport in that it has a really hyper-competitive, world-class athletic element to it. But like you're saying, it also has this entertainment element. Do those two facets of the sport or of the industry clash at all?
I think they absolutely, if you look at the competitive side of figure skating today and how it's developed, they certainly clash quite a bit. In the 1990s, after the whole scandal with Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding, skating was absolutely huge. You couldn't turn on your television on a Saturday without having 3 different channels having a professional competition or an ice show that were usually competing with each other. And the market got so saturated that by the late 90s, perhaps early 2000s, it just absolutely went kaboom, and then there was nothing. The thing is, as skating has developed now on the competitive side, if you turn on your television, you won't even find much of it, unfortunately. But if you follow skating and watch online, and some of the broadcasts that are available, you'll see that it's all about the quadruple jumps and the technical athletic side of skating. Show skating hasn't survived. It's survived, but it's not thriving, at least very publicly like it once did. So in a way, the athletic side has won out over the artistry for now, but skating is interesting in that it's quite cyclical. There have been periods in skating history where there was a focus on the technical and the athletic, and other periods where the artistry has been at the top of the bill, as it were. So it's cyclical, and I certainly believe there will be a time where the artistry will be at the forefront again, perhaps, and you're starting to see that now.
For a professional ice skater, which was the focus of it? Was somebody usually in the athletic realm earlier in their career, and then they'd move into the entertainment and artistry part, or were they almost two separate tracks?
I think you'd see, well, before, when I say before, I say until the line started to blur between amateurism and professionalism in skating, it was the normal track that people would take in their skating careers. They'd be a competitive skater. They'd focus on the technical side of their skating mainly. And then when they turned professional, they would either get into coaching or performing or both. And that's when artistry and entertainment would definitely be number one. So you had to have the skills on both sides when you were competing in the amateur rank. So when you turn professional, or when you would have turned professional years ago, the artistry certainly would have been at the forefront.
Somebody like Sonja Henie, where did she fit into the history of skating? She was born in the early 20th century, and she was active in probably the early to mid-century. How does she fit into the bigger picture of the ice skating field?
I think the ways that Sonja Henie fits into figure skating history are almost too numerous to mention. She was, when she started, she was just, when she first went to the Olympics in 1924, she was regarded by some as almost being like a bit of a circus act, because she was doing these jumps in these short skirts that her rivals weren't doing, and she was quite young, and some really didn't appreciate the athletic side that she was bringing to the sport. Over time, she really became unbeatable, and there's debate to this day as to whether all of her victories were on the up and up. She had a father who was a wealthy furrier, and certainly wasn't above trying to sway the influence of some of the judges at the time. There was one incident at the 1926 World Championships in Stockholm where one of Sonja's biggest competitors, her name was Herma Szabo, went to the Austrian consulate for some sort of a social event or a meeting of sorts. And at the time, it's been alleged by one of the other competitors at the event that someone from the Norwegian delegate was seen in the hallways, and the next day, when Herma Szabo went onto the ice, her skate had actually been meddled with, had been tampered with, and she almost wasn't even able to compete. She did compete, and she won, but that was the last time that she won. Sonja went on to win 10 World Championships consecutively. She won 3 Olympic gold medals. That was an unprecedented number at the time, and it still is to this day in women's single skating. And she was really the first skater, when she came to America, she was really the first skater to break into these big box office movies. And it was, again, her father who helped her do it. He helped her arrange a show in California before all of the big wigs in Hollywood, and it was almost like an audition, and she got the part. She certainly did. She got many parts. She wasn't a remarkable actress by any stretch of the imagination, but she certainly captured the attention and the adoration of the public. She was almost like, in a way, an adult Shirley Temple, if I can make a comparison. Very Scandinavian, but she was like a little China doll, and people just adored her. And for many people who didn't know anything about the sport, Sonja Henie would have drawn their attention to skating, and many champion skaters started skating because of Sonia Henne.
In the field, is she seen as almost a transitionary figure who changed the sport?
I think she's certainly seen as a figure who changed the sport. Well, in a way, she really did, because at the time when she won one of her championships, it was because the judging panel was heavily stacked against one of her competitors. So that in itself did change the sport, because after the ISU, which is the International Skating Union, changed its rules to only allow one judge per country, skating became fairer in time, arguably. But as a transitionary figure, I think she certainly showed what the athletic possibilities were for women. She was one transitionary figure, as were many of her competitors at the time. But the 1930s were a time of great change in skating anyway. But I think it's certainly fair to say that she is seen as a legend in skating, and is also a part of that transition from pure artistry in women's skating to that element of athleticism being introduced.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. So beforehand, what was the genesis of figure skating as a entertainment and a athletic competition? Where did that start?
Well, it's certainly a complicated thing to try to sum up in a few words, but I think one figure that's worth mentioning is in the 19th century, there was an American skater named Jackson Haynes who traveled to Europe and took every major European capital by storm by introducing theatrical skating to Europe. And he would wear these lavish costumes. He would dress up as a woman, as a bear. And he would actually ice dance with a male partner in Europe. And he was really a sensation. In Vienna, they loved him. They loved his waltzing on the ice. And he was someone that introduced the artistic aspect of skating. But in the early 20th century, skating was very much about carving school figures, so figure eight patterns onto the ice surface, and slowly jumping and spinning were two aspects of free skating that evolved and became more difficult over time. But skating was originally more of a science, and from a competitive aspect, more of a science, and the art came more over time. But Jackson Haynes was the first to really introduce the artistry to the sport, at least certainly the most famous.
Looking back at her with a hindsight of 60 years, technically speaking, skills-wise, how would you assess her? Like, how does is it what she did back then still impressive today?
I think what she did back then is absolutely impressive today. I think were the jumps that she was doing or the spins that she was doing as difficult as what skaters do today? Not even close. But she skated with greater speed than many skaters still do today. Hers was actually excellent. She performed these super fast flat foot spins, which you don't even see today. And she was pushing boundaries. And I think today skaters are pushing boundaries by doing 4 or 5, 6 quads in a program. That's a 4 revolution jump. But she was also performing axel jumps at the time, which many of her competitors weren't including. Some did, but many didn't. So I think that if you look at what she did in a historical context, it's certainly impressive.
Technologically speaking, a lot of sports have changed a lot just due to the nature of the equipment that they can use. Has there been big changes since then that make skaters more efficient or more effective?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the evolution in skate making, and it's still continuing to this day, is what is allowing the skaters that you'll see competing today to do these quadruple jumps and triple combinations. in the 19th century, they were performing on skates. They were actually blades that would be strapped to your foot. And in the earliest skates that have ever been found in history were actually animal bones. So, and they were used, they were actually attached with leather straps to the feet of skaters so that they could transport themselves over the ice. So if you think about that evolution from bones to these high-tech skates that you see today, I think the equipment that you have on your feet obviously plays a huge difference into what you're actually able to do.
This was a really enormous show that they were in with many different skaters. In a show like that, what does a schedule of theirs look like? I know, like, if a show comes to town, they're there maybe for a matinee and maybe one or two other shows. What is it like to be in one of those gigantic productions?
Well, I haven't been in one of those productions, so I certainly can't speak to that firsthand. But I mean, in many cases, they're flying in and out of town like the circus, and the setup time usually is minimal. Back in those days, it really would have been like the circus because they had, in the days of Sonja Henie, and with her skating tour, she had lavish stage sets, huge costumes with headpieces. There were props. Many times, the rinks that the venues that they'd be performing in, wouldn't even have enough seating. So they'd be building bleachers frantically, trying to get those prepared in time for the audiences to arrive. So it was a lot like a circus flying in and out of town.
What type of training goes along with becoming a skater of that quality and of that magnitude?
Well, for someone like Sonja, or any Olympic gold medalist ever, for that matter, constant training. In Sonja's day, school figures, which were the figure eights that I mentioned earlier, the patterns on the ice, they would have accounted for far more of the scoring than the free skating. So skaters had to be absolutely experts in that aspect of the skating, which was almost like, if you think about musical scales in singing, those were almost like the scales of skating. So they would be up early in the morning every day, practicing their figures, and not as much time would have been spent on free skating, but they still would have devoted a considerable amount of time to that. In Sonja's day, when she was competing, many skaters would flock to Switzerland, where there would be these grand skating resorts and winter resorts, and they would practice. Skaters from all around the world would practice alongside at these resorts, morning, afternoon, and night.
In the movie, they show her doing dance routines and even doing some singing. In the field, are there any other examples of that where somebody was multi-talented across different domains, so to speak?
I think a wonderful example is Belita Jepson-Turner, and she was the skater, as you mentioned earlier, that I recently did a biography of. And she was actually a very accomplished ballet dancer who performed with Anton Dolin, and of the Dolin Markova ballet. And she was also a film noir actress around the same time as Sonja. And I certainly think, as I said before, I don't think Sonja was an exceptional actress by any stretch of the imagination, nor do I necessarily think Belita was, but they were certainly comparable. And Belita was also an exceptional skater. So I think there are lots of other examples. I know that there are several skaters who have appeared in movies. So I think the ability to act and skate, and perhaps dance or sing or any other special talent that you might have would certainly be a way of putting more money on the table.
Skaters with these two different activities they can be in, what sort of wage can they garner from doing that? Back then and even to today, as far as even endorsements and that sort of thing, how do they make a living from this?
Well, when Sonia Mahoney was actually was a millionaire. She had a huge contract with 20th Century Fox, and she used a lot of, when she was doing her touring productions and her shows at the Center Theater in New York, she was putting a lot of her own money back into these skating shows. But as for earning, you would earn by touring, you would earn by movies back in her day. In the 1990s, when skating was enjoying that boom, as I mentioned earlier, after the whole Tonya Harding scandal, skaters would earn tens of thousands of dollars just for competing in a professional competition against their peers, and that's a lot of money if you really think about it for one night's work. And that oversaturation in the TV money certainly dwindled to where it is today. Professional competitions barely exist today. There's arguably 2, perhaps 3 that go on in the world. But most skaters today would make their money by doing certainly endorsements, by touring, but many turn to coaching to make a living in the sport. And that's something that's remained consistent with professional skaters from Sonia's day until today.
Where are the big hot spots of figure skating these days?
These days, what's so interesting, if you think about even if someone would have said this 50 years ago, or certainly back in Sonia's day, someone would have laughed, but because it just wasn't a hot spot of skating. But today, Asia, Japan, Korea, China, those are all countries where skating is hugely popular. And certainly in Korea and Japan especially, it's because of the fact that some of their skaters have had great success over the last 10 years. But it's astounding, really, because North America and continental Europe have certainly both had their turns in the spotlight when it came to being, the meccas of skating. But it's definitely Asia now.
In a place like your home of Canada, is there a competition with, say, hockey for the amount of people who would enter the sport?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think skating is a beloved sport here in Canada. It always has been, it still is. But hockey will always be number one here. I think young men have always kind of been steered towards hockey quite often. And increasingly today, or in the last 10 years especially, you're seeing a lot of young women that are also being steered towards hockey after they've kind of learned to skate. So hockey is always going to be number one, and hockey is what keeps a lot of the rinks open here in Canada and around the world. And as much as I'm not a fan whatsoever of it, I certainly I'm certainly thankful for hockey for keeping rinks open so that young people can learn how to skate.
Going back to the 90s, what are some other examples of figure skating that made it into the popular entertainment, such as movies or TV?
Oh, in the 1990s, in terms of bringing skating into the popular consciousness, Nancy and Tonya were really number one, because that became almost like a CNN story and a tabloid story. But there were certainly other examples of skating reaching a wider audience. Some of the made-for-TV professional competitions kind of appealed to younger audiences. They had a rock and roll skating championship. They had an event called the Great Skate Debate, where the audience got to vote, and that was one of the first times where the audience had their say in professional skating competitions. There was the hugely popular Parthenon Ice, which actually won an Emmy. And that was a beautiful production that helped skating reach a larger audience. Disney did a televised kind of packet show called The Greatest Hits on Ice, which a lot of people remember fondly. And another example of skating reaching a wider audience in the 90s was the fact that Katarina Witt, who was a two-time Olympic gold medalist in the 80s, actually posed for Playboy magazine in the 90s. And that is a different audience.
Yeah.
And it certainly drew some fans to the sport.
As a judge of figure skating, there's always been, especially from that 90s period, a controversy even going back into that between the Soviets and the Western countries, controversy in the judging. What are the qualifications in judging that you would look for as a figure skating judge?
Well, I only judged on a low level, and I judged actually while I was still competing, which is an interesting story in itself. But I judged under a system, and it would have been the system that Sonia Hedy competed under, and also the one that was in place in the 1990s, where skaters were ranked on a scale of 0 to 6.0. So anybody that would have watched skating in the 90s would have seen, someone would perform in a competition and they would get a score out of 6. So you'd see 5.9, 5.8, 5.7, 6.0. And it was a system in which you were ranking skaters from 1 through 31. But under the scoring system that's in place at the time, which I'm not an expert in, nor am I a fan of, skaters are accumulating points, and they're trying to outdo themselves in a way, and trying to get new personal best scores. So the judging system is completely different, and the two systems, the 6.0 system, which was in place, versus the current one, look for and reward completely different things.
What are some of the qualities that are different that they're looking for in each of those systems?
Well, under the 6.0 system, I think skaters they received two sets of marks. One was for technical merit, which was the technical side of skating, and one was for the artistic impression or presentation, which was more the artistic side. Under the current judging system, the scores that they receive are hugely weighted towards the technical difficulty in their program. Skaters are rewarded for doing more difficult jumps late in their program. They're rewarded by doing the same or similar footwork sequences and spin variations as other skaters, which are perceived as more difficult. So it's all about, it's become very cookie cutter in a sense right now, but the technical side is certainly valued more than the artistic side now than ever before.
Do you think that's an influence from other similar sports that are that follow a certain pattern where they're do maybe a performance and then they're judged based on that, or is that something that evolved within skating itself?
Well, I mean, the genesis for the system that's in place was the scandal that happened in the pairs event at the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, where two pairs ultimately ended up receiving gold medals because of a judging controversy. I think this system being in place, it attempts to quantify the unquantifiable. There's a certain magic to skating, which you say that this person was more magical than the other by giving one skater a 5.9 and one skater a 6.0. But this is the system that's in place is attempting to break down each individual element in the program and assign it its own score. It's very much, I see it as being very much like gymnastics, and it's just trying to quantify something which I don't think is quantifiable. many will disagree with me, and I don't like to badmouth the system that much, because I think that there's some wonderful skaters, and it is starting to improve somewhat now. But certainly 2 or 3 years ago, it was a bit rough in terms of overvaluing the technical side and not really assessing the performance side equally.
Where do you see figure skating going in the future?
I think that, as I said before, skating is really cyclical. There have been periods where the technical side has been valued as number one, and there have been other areas where the artistic side was really coming to the forefront. I think that there's a ceiling to the level of technical progress. It's certainly being raised every day today, but even with evolutions in skate making and in the technology, and perhaps even the judging system that's used, there's not going to be a day 100 years from now where skaters are doing 8 revolution jumps and doing 10 of them in their program. There's a ceiling somewhere, and although it's being pushed now, I think it's going to be sooner rather than later that it's going to reach that ceiling. And when that does happen, I think that the artistic side is going to start rising up again to meet the technical, or perhaps surpass it, because what can be achieved technically in skating is going to be achieved at some time, and then there's going to be an attempt for some other kind of progress.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. One question I had, like the athletes, even at the highest levels, like at the Olympics, they wear like very stylized outfits. Is that a holdover from a day where artistry was more valued?
I think the costuming and the fashion of skating, which is an interesting topic in itself, which I've explored a bit before on my blog, but it's something that makes skating unique. I don't think it's necessarily a holdover from a different time. I think that skaters are interpreting music, and they're using their costumes to reflect that. I think if they were all wearing these skin-tight little outfits like speed skaters do, or wearing jerseys like hockey players do, a lot of the mystique would be taken out of skating, and a lot of the charm of skating's relationship with music would be lost entirely.
What are your final takeaways? Can you say, like, maybe to yourself, what does this represent for figure skating, and maybe what you love about figure skating?
I think it was what I love about Hello London is it's just this charming snapshot of Sonia Henney attempting to make this comeback, but having matured a bit from that young showgirl that she was when she was performing in her 20th Century Fox films, to more of an adult. And I think she was a delightful skater. She was a little bit controversial, but I think it speaks to a different time in skating, when the costumes, when the big production numbers and ensemble numbers were perhaps cherished a little bit more. And what really heartens me is the fact that if you look at Stars on Ice, which here in Canada is the only cross-country touring show that still exists, and they've not only retained, but they've upped the bar on those production numbers in many ways. So I think seeing Hello London reminds me of a different time in theatrical skating, but watching something like Stars on Ice now is something that shows that those big flashy group numbers are still alive, and it's just charming to me. It's very charming.
And we've talked a lot about Sonia Henney. Maybe you can tell us the end of her life was, because she didn't live too much longer after this movie was made.
No, it's really quite sad. she had leukemia, and she was married 3 times. It's said that her third husband, which was a Norwegian shipping magnate named Niels Onstad, was really the love of her life. So I really think she was happier than she'd ever been around the end of her life, but she still had, she was still kind of holding on to her glory days. She actually passed away on an airplane while traveling overseas at the age of 57 in 1969 rather. And really it really wasn't long after Hello London at all. So she never got to have that big comeback that she'd hoped to achieve, but she'd certainly lived an incredible life and had huge successes. And I do believe that she was happy in her later days.
Can you tell us a bit about the biography you wrote of Belita Jepson Turner?
Absolutely. Belita, I don't think that she was necessarily a rival of Sonia Henney, but I also don't think that they necessarily liked each other very much at all. But she was just this delightful skater that just hasn't been historically remembered to the same degree that Sonia has. And there had never been what I considered to be a satisfactory look at her skating. And I was fortunate enough to receive a lot of help and have some access to some material about Belita's life that wasn't out in the public eye. And I really enjoyed delving in to tell her story because she was an actress, a dancer, and a skater. And like Sonia, she was really kind of weaving out in and out from different worlds in that sense. But I feel that it was important to tell Belita's story, and I'm glad I was able to. And I really hope more people are open to reading and learning more about her because I've chosen to release her story. It's basically a free book online. I didn't want I wanted to be able to make everything accessible. I didn't want to make a penny off of it, nor do I ever want to for any of the writing and research I do, because I think that skating history should be accessible to everyone. And it was important for me to tell Belita's story, as it is important for me to tell the stories of many skaters from around the world.
Thank you very much for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to our guest today, Ryan Stevens of the Skate Guard blog. Links to learn more about Ryan and his blog can be found at skateguard1.blogspot.com or in the show notes. You can also find a link to Ryan's free definitive biography of British figure skater and actress Belita Jepson Turner at his blog and in the show notes. If you would like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes and connect to all the social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback. We can talk about movies, and I would definitely like to hear your idea for future episode topics. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes, or now Apple Podcasts if you prefer. Ratings and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. Apple Podcasts or iTunes reviews also let other people find out about the show. We'll see you next time beyond the big screen.